Nakba 75. There's a lot of talk about how the current Israeli government is made up of fascists, racists, and religious extremists. A few days ago, the EU pulled out of a meeting because National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir intended to come and speak. But Israel was created by the three X's: extermination, expulsion, and expunging the Palestinians from history. Let's look at each of them in turn. Plan Dalet was the carefully planned invasion, destruction, and expulsion of Palestinians. No neighboring Arab countries came to help from November 47 until May, whilst the attacks were going on. Only after the British left on the 14th or 15th, which is actually, if we're back in 48, it will be tomorrow or the day after, did any half-hearted help arrive. So already 250,000 Palestinians had been ethnically cleansed or expelled from their homes. 150 Palestinian villages had been destroyed. Any help that the Palestinians were helped by some of their neighbors after the 15th of May, but those armies were badly trained and badly armed. And in fact, the leader of the Arab armies, King Abdullah of Jordan, had already secretly agreed the division of Palestine with Ben-Gurion. Extermination. The most famous massacre was Deir Yassin on 9th April 48. So that would have been over a month ago. The British were still in control. So Deir Yassin was attacked by Jewish terrorist groups, Ergun and Lehi, or Stern Gang. But they were also helped by the Palmach, which were the shock troops of the Haganah terrorist group. Jacques de Reynier, who was with the Red Cross, heard about what had happened, and he forced his way there. So I'm just going to read a few sentences from his report. He says, "I reached the village with my convoy. The gang was wearing country uniforms with helmets. All of them were young, some even adolescents, men and women, armed to the teeth, revolvers, machine guns, hand grenades, and also large cutlasses, swords, in their hands, most of them still blood-stained. A beautiful young girl with criminal eyes showed me hers, still dripping with blood. She displayed it like a trophy. This was the cleaning up team that was obviously performing its task very conscientiously. I tried to go into a house. A dozen soldiers surrounded me, their machine guns aimed at my body, and their officer forbade me to move. The dead, if any, would be brought to me," he said. "I then flew into one of the most towering rages of my life, telling these criminals what I thought of their conduct, threatening them with everything I could think of, and then pushed them aside and went into the house. The first room was dark. Everything was in disorder, but there was no one. In the second, amid disemboweled furniture and covers and all sorts of debris, I found some bodies, cold. Here, the cleaning up had been done with machine guns, then hand grenades. It had been finished off with knives. Anyone could see that. The same thing in the next room. But as I was about to leave, I heard something like a sigh. I looked at everywhere, turned over all the bodies, and eventually found a little foot, still warm. It was a little girl of 10, mutilated by a hand grenade, but still alive. As I was about to carry her out, the officer tried to stop me, blocking the doorway. I pushed him aside and went through with my precious load. The ambulance set off with orders to come back as soon as possible. As the gang had not dared to attack me directly, I could continue. I gave orders for the bodies in this house to be loaded onto the truck and went into the next house, and so on. Everywhere, it was the same horrible sight. I found only 2 more people alive, both women, one of them an old grandmother, hidden behind a heap of firewood where she had kept quiet for at least 24 hours. There had been 400 people in this village. About 50 of them had escaped and were still alive. So he was from the Red Cross and managed to get to Deir Yassin, and as you heard, he saved a little girl. No British soldier, no British police officer arrived at that place. Testimonies about Deir Yassin from Jewish sources were also collected by an Israeli filmmaker called Netta Shoshani, and they described things like a young man tied to a tree and set on fire, a woman and an old man shot in the back, 2 girls aged 16 or 17 lined up against a wall and shot with a submachine gun. Western journalists were actually invited into the village because they wanted the news to get out, and so that they wanted to tell other Palestinians what would happen to them unless they fled. I remember when I was young, I heard one of these journalists being interviewed on the radio. Despite that, some Israeli historians call it a blood libel. Another massacre at Tantura. There was a Jewish researcher at the university called Katz, and he investigated this massacre, and then he was accused of, again, blood libel. Ilan Pape, who was also another Israeli historian, he wrote the famous book, The Ethnic Cleansing of the Palestinians. He commented, as a faculty member of Haifa University, that's in Israel, I posted on the university's internal website some of the more important transcripts of the more than 60 hours of Katz tapes. So Katz had interviewed various Israelis who had been at Deir Yassin, at Tantura. Most of those tapes had not been referred to previously. They included horrific descriptions of execution, of the killing of fathers in front of children, of rape and torture. They came from both the Jewish and the Palestinian witnesses. So that was the extermination. Let's look at expulsion. Herzl wrote in his diary in 1895, we must expropriate gently. Expropriate, basically steal gently. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it any employment in our country. It's already become his country in 1895. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor. So by expropriation he means stealing Palestinian land, and by removal of the poor he means what we call ethnic cleansing. It must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. So he wants to do it in secret. That was in his diary, 12th of June, 1895. In 1897, there was the first Zionist Congress. 2 rabbis had been sent to Palestine to investigate the land. They sent back a cable. They said, the bride is beautiful, but married to another man. In other words, the bride, i.e. Palestine, is beautiful. It's not a desert. And it's married to another man. In other words, there are Palestinians there. It's not a land without people. They knew in 1897. In 1899, Herzl sent a letter to the mayor of Jerusalem. He wrote that Zionism did not pose a threat of displacement for the Arab inhabitants of Palestine. And if the Zionists were not wanted in Palestine, we will find elsewhere what we need. However, you can see that in his private diaries, it's exact opposite. He wrote in 1901 in a draft charter for the Jewish Ottoman Land Corporation that he proposed that the state have the authority to move native populations from one place to another, but he never openly spoke about the need to transfer Palestinian Arabs to pave the way for Zionism. That was Herzl. He was probably the first of the modern Zionists. He was followed by another important Zionist was Chaim Weizmann, and he was the one who obtained the Balfour Declaration. He was in Palestine when someone called Leopold Weiss spoke to him and asked him this question: How can you ever hope to make Palestine your homeland in the face of the vehement opposition of the Arabs who, after all, are the majority in this country? Weizmann replied, "We expect they won't be a majority after a few years." This is in about 1922. Yet, it was Weizmann who invented the propaganda lie of the century, a country without people for a people without a country. It was a complete lie, and they knew it right from the very beginning. The next most important Zionist was David Ben-Gurion. He took over from Weizmann as leader of the Jewish Agency, and he was the one who organized Plan Dalet, which, as I've mentioned, was the massacres and expulsions of 1948. He also, okay, I'm being asked to wind up. Okay, I wanted to talk about apartheid, which has already been mentioned. We know there are more than 65 Israeli laws that discriminate against Palestinians, directly or indirectly, and you can look them up on the Adalo database. There's a few phrases I want to mention, actually. One is present absentees. So basically, when I was at school, they would take the register in the morning. If you were present, you would say, "Yes, I'm present," or "present," and you would be marked down at the school. If you were absent, you would be marked absent. So Israel invents this new term called present absentee. So if you were literally not in your house on a particular date, maybe there was violence, so you escaped to the neighboring village. If you weren't in your house on that date, then your house could be taken away from you, and it would be given to someone else who would be Jewish. So it's a way of stealing the land. A lot of this stolen Palestinian land was handed over to the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. And land that is obtained by the JNF can only ever be bought or leased by Jews. It's forbidden for Palestinians to buy or rent it. Israel also invented something called unrecognized villages. That's villages that existed before Israel existed. I just want to say something about the administrative detention, which is how Israel basically in the occupied territories, it can send anyone to prison and they don't know what they've been charged with. Their lawyers won't know what they've been charged with, and it can be renewed after 6 months. So we've had a Palestinian prisoner recently, Khadr Adnan. He was basically killed by the Israelis. He was on administrative detention for years and years, and he went on a hunger strike, and he's been on a number of hunger strikes because of this unbelievable law, which actually the British used in Palestine as well. And he's died very recently after an 87-day hunger strike. Okay, I want to mention